Good morning, everybody. It's always good to be back here at Peace Church, and thanks my colleague, my dear friend, Pastor Holly McKissick, for her very generous introduction. I'm standing back. I'm on the tail end of COVID. I'm past the incubation period, but I'm still trying to be careful. So if I don't engage you more directly this morning, that's the reason why. It's not because I don't want to. In fact, it's been a little torturous having to kind of seclude myself. I'm not used to that, and I missed a few things recently, like a wedding I was supposed to do for a dear friend, and makes me think about others who have to confront illness and how it can be, if not in a way, kind of marginalizing it, and it kind of makes me more cognizant of the need to connect with people who are separated from community due to illness. Couple of prefatory comments before I kind of get into Israel a little bit. And when I do get into Israel, I'm going to give you a little my own background, my life story, like in 2 minutes or less in relation to Israel, and then my own perspective on where we are right now. And then hopefully most of what will happen this morning is questions and discussion. I'm really looking forward to that piece more than anything else. The prefatory part is you're not getting the Jewish opinion, you're getting a Jewish opinion. You probably heard this saying, the only thing two Jews can agree on is how much the third Jew should be giving the synagogue. So keep that in mind. And I have kind of glommed on to something that President Obama said about the conflict, and which is, we are really compelled in this moment to hold on to multiple conflicting truths. And for me, I am dubious, wary, skeptical of anyone who asserts that they've got this figured out with any level of certainty. I have been, as you can imagine, inundated with different perspectives and differing views, and people in my rabbinic world who are struggling as to the best path forward. And for me, that usually means the rabbinic community that's on the progressive side of things. So I say this as somebody who's on this path of struggle to try and figure out what is the best path forward. And finally, a side note and a personal one. Tonight and tomorrow is my father's yortzeit. It's been 36 years since he died, and we always, every year, we honor memory in that way. And there's a prayer we say, and we come together as community to honor each other's own memory. So I think he would have been really happy that I'm here talking to you all this morning. So in that sense, my comments I really dedicate to his memory. So, my little life story. Way back when, and I know, in a log cabin, my first Hebrew school teacher was nothing, and for us, Hebrew school started in the 3rd grade. And she was my Hebrew school teacher for 3 years, and she and her husband ended up being family friends, Tzivia and Joe Gaba. They were very Israel-centric, and that's the kind of Jewish education I grew up on, was a very Israel-centric Jewish education. Wasn't the only thing that was discussed, but it was always front and center. Tzivia and Joe were what is known as chalutzim, which means Israeli pioneers. They were among the Zionists who settled the land of Israel, haaretz, the land. We only later found out, much later in life, that they were gun runners for the Irgun. I would have found that a much more interesting story, particularly as a kid, but it kind of tells you where they were. And after the Six-Day War in '67, you know, the big news song in the Jewish world was Yerushalayim Shel Zachav, Jerusalem of Gold. And to get the solo, to be able to sing it, was a big deal. And we always had this sense that Israel was not just a religiously central piece to us, it was the Jewish moral center. We kind of glommed onto the idea that Golda Meir's famous saying, which is, we can forgive you for killing our kids. We cannot forgive you for compelling us to kill your kids. So we had this sense of, well, I'll say it, Jewish exceptionalism back then. And I personally retained that for a long, long time. Fast forward to when my boys were in high school, and I was, still am in some ways, but not the same way, active in the Jewish community. Two of my three boys, my two older boys, both did high school semesters in Israel during the Second Intifada. I actually was on a mission during the Second Intifada with 7 other national Jewish leaders. You could roll a bowling ball through downtown Jerusalem and not hit a soul. So the commitment to Israel had remained strong even then. And the change started to occur, and it's been a long time since I've been actually. There was a period of time where I was in Israel, I think 9 times in 7 years. And the last time when I was in seminary, I don't know if it was 2009, 2010, I was there in the summer to do some studying, and then my wife Faye came over, and I'd always loved Jerusalem. It was always my favorite place to visit in Israel for its spiritual significance for me. It was different the last time I was there. There was a sense of animosity and wariness of the other, and it was reflected both outside of the Jewish community toward the Israeli Arab community. We had caught a cab right after Shabbat to go have dinner, and the cab driver said, "It's good you got in my cab because the next cab is being driven by an Arab." We found that incredibly upsetting. And there was animosity within the Jewish community. So one of the books I brought, and I may talk more about it in a bit, is this book called The Holocaust is Over, We Must Rise from Its Ashes by Avram Burg. Burg was a speaker of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and I had a colleague here in town who knew I was going to Israel and says, "Can you get a copy of this book in Hebrew?" So I went into a bookstore and said, "I want to get a copy of this book." She literally walked out of the store and stood out in front of the store, refusing to wait on me until I left. I had never had that kind of experience before from Jew to Jew. So it already was starting to feel different. And where I always had loved Jerusalem and Tel Aviv less so, the last trip I came to love Tel Aviv and saw that as the real dream of Israel and of the Jewish people, which is sitting in a cafe. There's a street in Tel Aviv called Bialik Street. It's after the first poet laureate of Israel, Chaim Bialik. His house is on that street. There are Israeli artists who lived on that street. And at the front of the street, the head of the street, there's the Bialik Cafe. And there are all these Jews sitting around, drinking espresso, smoking, because you get, a fuller sense of the experience that way. And even in my very challenged Hebrew, they were arguing with each other, but arguing with each other kind of in a joyous way. And that's my dream of Israel, is to sit in a cafe and be who we are without having to look over our shoulder and wonder what's going to happen. But I kind of feel that dream is losing itself. And what's going on now, what's been going on for a while, has made us kind of less of who we are, or really at least who I think we should be and who we want to be. So that brings me to where we are right now. Netanyahu, as Holly alluded to, not my favorite person. Unless you're a Trump lover, then if you say Netanyahu's Trump with a better command in the English language, then yeah, you think, you can add it to Trump's list of favorite dictators and authoritarian figures. But in relation to what's going on right now and Netanyahu's desire to stay out of jail for corruption, bribery, go down the whole list. Amongst the people, so another topic for another day is Israel's coalition government and the challenges that poses, but he had a bare majority, and it was really plurality and not a full majority, so he had to put together a coalition government. Two of the people he appointed, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, they're domestic terrorists. They were part of what is, of their Kahanis. The late Mayor Kahani was a Jewish domestic terrorist, and they are too. And basically, Netanyahu turned them loose on the West Bank. And they have encouraged, supported, participated with the Israeli settler movement, which I think the best way I can describe it is misguided, to really violate Palestinian rights in the West Bank. And at the very least, Netanyahu turned a very conscious blind eye to what's going on. Well, when you do that, it necessitated more of an army, an IDF presence in the West Bank, so it was fewer IDF soldiers down south on the border with Gaza. In addition to that, Netanyahu didn't care too much about the Israeli Jews and the kibbutzim down south near the Gaza border because they were peaceniks. And they weren't his people. They weren't the people voting for Netanyahu. So he was fine leaving them vulnerable. He was propping up Hamas in order to diminish the power of PLA in the West Bank, which was also the nicest thing you could say about it is a misguided strategy. So all of this led to it being more and more probable that something bad would happen on the Gaza-Israeli border. And lo and behold, it did. Now, I say all this without giving any excuse to Hamas. And for those who question about what they did, I as a very progressive Jew, have no question that what they did was horrific, violent, stomach-turning. Rape as a tool of war and a political tool is beyond excusable, and I have no excuse for them. And I honestly think the world would be a better place without them. But that said, the notion of Israel eradicating Hamas, I think, is a fool's errand. I don't think, at the very least, in this, leveling Gaza in order to eradicate Hamas, you're creating the next generation of Hamas. And that is my ultimate fear. All that said, I don't see a short-term good outcome. There is nothing that's going to happen good in the short term. So what I am striving for in this space and in this moment is, and then what? I am really focused on, and then what? And if I have any glimmer of hope is that as tragedy occurs on a daily basis, that there is also more and more discussion, believe it or not, of a two-state solution. A whole other discussion whether you think it ought to be one unified Israel or some kind of two-state solution or something on the model of the EU. If there's some sense of peace and we're getting along and we're honoring each other's dignity and humanity, then I'm good regardless of the structure. Which is also to say, in regard to this striving for and then what, I've reached out to Palestinians here in town. I've had a couple of good discussions. I don't know where it will lead. One of the women is got family in Gaza, and I worry and pray for her family every day. And where things go and what happens can change our ability to be in discussion with each other. But You know, I'm a rabbi. Optimism and hope is in my job description, so I continue to lay in that space. So in those discussions, the things we talked about, the things I really asserted in the discussion is, to move forward, we're going to have to, one, recognize the pain of the other. For Palestinians, it's Nakba and an ongoing fear of displacement, as was the case in '48. For Jews, it's the Holocaust, and that represents much of the response of Israeli Jews, Jews here in the States, to what happened on October 7th. Both responses are valid and real, and as I told these wonderful Palestinian women, I said, until we recognize the pain of the other and recognize each other's humanity and dignity, we're not going to be able to move forward. So I mentioned this book. This book suggests, speaking of the Holocaust, that we using, you know, however valid the response is to not wanting 1/3 of our people to be slaughtered again, 6 million people, it doesn't necessarily make for good policy and get us closer to peace. And that's really the thrust of Berg's book. The other book that I would say from a quasi-political, philosophical standpoint is this book, Peter Beinart's Crisis of Zionism. By the way, words like, you know, are you a Zionist, are you pro-Zionist, are you anti-Zionist, I think is a distraction. There are, even before all this, there were like 5 different types of categories of Zionist. Again, another discussion, but, you know, I got on a meeting of folks advocating for a ceasefire, and they saw the one rabbi was on, that's really great. Glad that rabbi's an anti-Zionist. Well, I'm not an anti-Zionist. I'm not sure what I am in relation to that, but it's a distraction. Peter Beinart wrote this book in 2014, so well before this. And you'll see Peter Beinart wrote for The Atlantic, and now he writes for a progressive Jewish publication called Jewish Currents. He's been on MSNBC from time to time. And his question for us Jews is this: are we going to be perpetually the world's victim for all eternity? And if we're not a victim, how do we respond when we're no longer see ourselves as a victim's role? So that's Beinart. He's shifted from a 2-state solution to a 1-state solution. I'm not sure whether he's still there or not, but I like Beinart. The other 2 books I brought are this one, I Shall Not Hate, by Izzeldin Abuleish. He is a doctor who lived in Gaza who lost a wife and daughter to an Israeli bomb and has been ever since an advocate for peace. He actually got a lot of his medical training in Israel, so he had that contact. I don't think he lives in Israel, or doesn't live in Gaza anymore, but I take a lot from what he wrote. And then the other book is In This Place Together, A Palestinian Journey to Collective Liberation, written by Penina Eilberg-Schwartz. Penina's mother, Rabbi Amy Eilberg, was the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi by the conservative Jewish movement. And Suleiman Khatib actually stabbed an Israeli police officer in the West Bank and was in jail for a period of years, and came out a peace activist. So that is where I draw my inspiration and my hope.
So this is just kind of a question/comment about Doug. The other thing you have to know about Doug is the congregation he has founded and led, it has become a home for, you know, trans, queer, LGBTQ, young Jewish folks, and just across the breadth, kind of just a really welcoming place, a place where interfaith dialogue happens, a place where they're deeply involved with many of the same causes we are, working with the migrant farm workers, et cetera. And so I guess the thing I would say is kind of a question is, you know, just as we think about the global, how it is that we dig in locally, and again, how just in your own personal life you have used, again, the own hurts you've had as a way of bridging and reaching out to others?
The most oft-repeated commandment in our written Torah in the 5 books of Moses is some variation of how we treat the stranger. And it is central to my theological perspective in that. And by the way, part of that perspective is I always see Judaism as more behavior-based theology than faith-based theology. I mean, on the front end, you kind of buy into the idea of the God you can't touch, talk to directly, whatever. We look for evidence of God's creative world and God's presence in that world. But there's a little bit of a faith buy-in on the front end, but after that, the way Jews connect to God is through how we behave. And so we tell you how to act in exhaustive detail. Bar-Ilan University did a survey of Jewish codes of law, Jewish sources of law. They came up with 9 single-space pages of sources of law. It's a rabbinic student's nightmare. But you know, the idea of how we treat the stranger, and the many times it's repeated in the 5 books of Moses, starts out as don't oppress the stranger, evolves into from a negative, a prohibitive commandment, what you don't do, to what you are obligated to do, which is to love the stranger. And ultimately, you should love the stranger because God loves the stranger. That ends up in Deuteronomy. And why? Because we were strangers in the land of Egypt, because we knew what it was like to be a stranger. And if you plug in to what it's like to be that stranger, to be marginalized, to be oppressed, you would never want anyone else to feel that way. And that is really the driving force behind everything we do at Kol Ami. And it always remains front and center in how we act in the world and how we act in the community. And as I've told people in regard to the present, war and all that I'm troubled about, nobody's coming to me to sign any agreements. I'm not signing anything away. I'm not at the negotiating table with Secretary Blinken. I can only do what I can do. And I think what I can do is to reach out in our local community and forge the best relationships that we can possibly forge.